A glove, sitting in an empty field, 2 miles from a missing woman's home, under the harsh Arizona sun, where evidence doesn't usually survive for long. Investigators collected it carefully, bagged it, documented it, then rushed it to a lab. Because if that glove belonged to the person who showed up at Nancy Guthrie's front door, it could change everything. Days passed. The nation waited. Then the DNA results came back. But instead of solving the mystery, the results created an even bigger one. Because the DNA didn't match anyone in the FBI database. No name. No criminal history. Nothing. And investigators quietly revealed something else. That glove wasn't the only place unknown DNA had already been found. So the question now becomes unavoidable. If the DNA belongs to someone who isn't in the system, then who was standing outside Nancy Guthrie's door? This investigation now revolves around one critical question. Did the person captured on surveillance outside Nancy Guthrie's home leave the DNA investigators just discovered? Because if that answer is yes, then the case may have its first real forensic lead. But if the answer is no, then investigators could be dealing with multiple unknown individuals connected to the disappearance. And in complex investigations like this, one detail can change the entire direction of the case. Right now, the DNA evidence is doing exactly that. Nancy Guthrie, a resident of Tucson, Arizona, a quiet desert city surrounded by miles of open Sonoran landscape. Friends describe her as someone who lived a relatively normal life. Routine, predictable, not someone investigators expected to become the center of a national missing person investigation. But everything changed the day surveillance cameras captured an unidentified individual approaching her home. The footage was clear enough for the FBI to release publicly. A man, standing at the door, carrying a firearm in a holster. That image instantly became the focal point of the investigation. But here's something investigators notice that most people didn't. The holster. It didn't match the gun inside it. At first glance, that sounds minor, probably irrelevant. But in forensic investigations, small mismatches matter. And sometimes they lead somewhere unexpected. Is that coincidence? Maybe. But in cases like this, investigators are trained to notice everything. Let's reconstruct what investigators know so far. Because timelines are where cases like this often begin to unravel. Nancy Guthrie was last confirmed to be at her home in Tucson. At some point after that, surveillance cameras captured an unidentified individual arriving at the property. The person appears to approach the door during daylight hours. Visible in the footage, a backpack, a jacket, and a semi-automatic handgun inside a holster. Investigators began analyzing every detail in that footage, frame by frame, zooming in, enhancing, looking for anything identifiable. And that's when the holster detail surfaced. The holster model did not appear to be designed for the handgun it was carrying. That mismatch created a starting point. Because unlike faces, retail products leave trails. Investigators began contacting gun stores across the Tucson area, specifically asking about purchases of that unusual holster model. Eventually, they narrowed it down to approximately 40 people. 40 individuals who had purchased that specific holster in the region. In a city of nearly 1 million people. That's a very small list. But investigators didn't stop there. They asked a second question. Of those 40 people, who also purchased the same type of handgun, because if someone bought both items, the probability becomes difficult to ignore. And that is where the investigation begins to narrow. According to reporting from investigative journalists following the case, law enforcement began contacting local gun stores to trace those purchases. Retail records, transaction logs, sales data. This kind of work is slow, painstaking, but extremely powerful. Former federal investigators often describe this phase as forensic compression, a large case gradually narrowing from thousands of possibilities to dozens, eventually to a few. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office confirmed that DNA recovered from the glove was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database containing DNA profiles from more than 21 million individuals, convicted offenders, arrestees, unknown forensic samples. If a DNA profile exists in that system, CODIS usually finds it. But this time, it didn't. During a press conference, the sheriff announced the result. No match. But investigators were very careful with their wording. And sometimes, what officials don't say is just as important as what they do say. Authorities previously confirmed that unknown DNA was also recovered inside Nancy Guthrie's home. DNA that did not belong to Nancy herself. But during the press conference, officials did not confirm whether the DNA from the glove matched the DNA inside the house. That comparison was never addressed. No confirmation, no denial, just silence. And in investigative terms, that gap matters, because if the two DNA samples match, then the person connected to the glove may have been inside the home. But if they don't match, then investigators could be dealing with multiple individuals connected to the scene. Law enforcement has not clarified this, at least not publicly. The DNA itself also raised procedural questions. According to officials, the glove was initially sent to a laboratory in Florida for testing. But there's a complication. FBI protocol typically requires evidence to be processed by an approved lab within the state where it was collected before it can be entered into CODIS. The glove was recovered in Arizona, meaning the evidence may have needed to return to Arizona for additional processing. That detail was mentioned briefly, but not fully explained. Again, this does not suggest wrongdoing. Evidence processing in large investigations often involves multiple labs, but it does highlight how complicated forensic workflows can become, especially when a case spans multiple jurisdictions. And right now, the DNA evidence is still very much active. Because a CODIS miss does not mean the trail is over. In fact, it often means investigators try something else. In modern investigations, there is another method that has solved cases traditional databases could not. Investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of searching criminal databases, investigators upload DNA profiles to genealogy platforms, looking for partial matches, distant relatives, shared genetic markers. From there, analysts build family trees, tracing relationships across generations, eventually narrowing toward a possible identity. This technique famously identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after more than 4 decades. It is powerful, but it also comes with limitations. Major consumer platforms like 23andMe and Ancestry do not allow law enforcement searches. That leaves smaller opt-in databases like GEDmatch. Even so, it has worked before. and investigators in the Guthrie case are now positioned to explore that path, which means somewhere out there, a distant relative might unknowingly hold the key to identifying the person connected to that DNA. But there is another element investigators are quietly pursuing: retail records. The surveillance footage didn't only show a holster. It showed a backpack and jacket. Investigators traced those items to Walmart, and that introduces another enormous data set. There are 9 Walmart stores in the Tucson area alone, each with surveillance systems, transaction records, receipt logs. Investigators are now reviewing those purchases, looking for a specific combination. One person buying a holster, a handgun, a backpack, and a jacket. If those purchases align with one name, that is not proof of a crime, but it becomes a powerful investigative lead, one that may justify a closer interview or further forensic analysis. It's important to state something clearly. Law enforcement has not publicly named any suspects in this case. No one shown in the surveillance footage has been identified, and no individual connected to the investigation has been accused of wrongdoing. This report is not suggesting guilt. However, the public record raises legitimate questions about the forensic evidence investigators are now examining, and those questions remain unanswered. At the center of all of this is still one person: Nancy Guthrie, a woman whose disappearance triggered an investigation involving local police, federal agents, forensic analysts, and thousands of tips from the public. Her family has offered a $1 million reward for information leading to answers. That number tells you something. Someone out there knows something. Investigators are following DNA evidence, retail purchase records, surveillance footage, and digital forensic trails. Somewhere in that data, there may be a name, but until that name appears, the most important fact remains unchanged. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and someone knows what happened in that window of time. If you have any information related to this case, contact authorities. And if you want deeper investigative breakdowns like this one, subscribe to this channel, because the next development in this case may already be unfolding.